In this movie, we're going to take a brief look at box blur. And actually, box blur is probably the most advanced of these simple blurs, meaning fast Gaussian and box blur. But because fast blur and Gaussian blur are more simple, I kind of talk more about blurring as a concept in those movies. Here we're just going to take a brief look at what separates box blur from fast and Gaussian blur. And let's go ahead and apply a box blur to our little shape layer here. And basically, as we increase the blur radius, we start to see that this effect kind of has, this is supposed to be a quote unquote bad result from this, but it starts making these kind of square shapes with the blur. And that's because the quality is lowered. That's kind of an interesting effect. I kind of like sometimes when you blur it and you get these kind of more rectangular geometric edges. That's kind of a cool result. I'm actually going to turn off the view of the shape layer by clicking this button right here. Get rid of that. That's kind of an interesting shape. But the reason why it's getting kind of boxy is because these iterations are low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take down the blur radius and take up the iterations to 3. With the iterations at 3, it basically has the quality of fast blur. So the default 1 is kind of like below fast blur, 3 is fast blur, but we can actually set this even higher than fast blur. So we have a really, really advanced blur, basically several iterations of this same box blur. And of course, we have the same parameters that we do in a lot of other blur effects as well. So we could blur just the horizontal axis, just the vertical axis. We can repeat edge pixels. So that way, if there's an object that's too close to the edge, you can check repeat edge pixels, and the pixels close to the edge will repeat themselves so you don't have a gap there. So essentially, again, in summary, it's this iterations property that sets box blur away from the herd and makes it a little bit more advanced than the other simple blurs like fast and Gaussian. And again, when we get to fast and Gaussian blur, we'll talk a little bit more about blurring as a concept, when and why you'd want to use it, and that type of thing. But for now, that is a look at box blur.